In this webinar, we focused on how we can seize this moment when the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements are driving us to look more deeply at gender and racial justice in our organizations and in our work. To do this deep work in safeguarding, we examined how we can look at power and privilege and move past compliance in our responses. First, Sally Proudlove of UNICEF UK shared with us the leadership tools she's developing to help organizations move from compliance to culture change, creating some interesting insights. They have found that healthy culture means an explicit safeguarding ethos with values and behaviors that are both articulated and lived at each level of the organization, as well as a culture of curiosity, scrutiny, and constructive challenge with processes to underpin these behaviors. The role of senior leaders is also paramount. They need to live by and act on the organization's values and consider how their interactions and relationships with other senior managers are experienced by the organization. Sally challenged us to think about who gets a seat at the table and has the decision-making power, what behaviors indicate genuine shifts in power, and how do leaders demonstrate that safeguarding is a priority. Then Everjoyce Wynne of ActionAid challenged us to think more deeply about how power operates, and in particular to consider invisible and hidden forms of power. She notes that our organizational cultures will not change if we only address compliance or if we only address visible and formal forms of power. We also need to dig deeper and do the uncomfortable work of challenging all forms of power. She demonstrated that power is relative and held by groups and by individuals, and that we need to think about how to build positive power, the power to hold power to account. She asks us to think about who owns the change as much as who owns the cultures of impunity. These examinations will necessarily require deep work on our attitudes and norms around race, gender, and the North-South divide. Lastly, Geeta Misra of Kriya revealed the importance of looking at the nuances and fault lines of SEAH and the need to step away from absolutes. We know there are no absolutes only because this is how we experience life. Within the context of SEAH, as much as possible, we need to ask which parts of it can and should be black and white, and which parts need more interrogation around the fault lines and the nuances. Let's not overcomplicate for the sake of overcomplicating. Yet, we want to move from compliance to deeper, more meaningful shifts in organizational culture. So we also need to understand the different faces of power, with all its contradictions and complications. Building on Everjoyce's point, Geeta referenced the work of Srilata Batliwala, who talks about the concept of invisible power as the most problematic of all the faces of power, because we never see it unless we know exactly how and where to look for it. Batliwala defines invisible power as the power to shape the way people think and feel about themselves and the force that creates social attitudes, biases, and the way our desires and needs are influenced. Geeta warns that it is impossible to tackle any issue around gender, including SEAH, by creating experts or people who preside over it. Organizational safeguarding is not solely the job of HR or legal teams. When we establish individuals as experts, we create hidden pockets of power. We stop learning, growing, and benefiting from each other's input. We need to bear in mind that power and privilege don't always sit where you expect them to. We all sit within different types of hierarchies. We are at the top of some and at the bottom of others. The first step is understanding the different ways this plays out within an organization. The goal is to move from protecting women to protecting women's rights, from prioritizing respectability to prioritizing respect for all, from a focus on preventing harm to a more positive focus on well-being. Organizations that can do this are truly challenging power and privilege and will achieve safeguarding. 3 questions were discussed by the panelists. First, what can we learn from the failures of gender mainstreaming when it comes to integrating safeguarding into organizations? Second, what impact does colonial dynamics and white savior narratives have on our ability to safeguard? And if safeguarding is a journey, where does culture change fit into that journey, and how long does it take? The panelists described some of the failures of gender mainstreaming at the time as due to the lack of analysis of power dynamics. So gender mainstreaming became a set of tools or approaches overlaid on existing power inequities, which were not examined or challenged. The takeaway is that tools are only helpful if they support and enable the right discussions. They are not, in and of themselves, the magic bullet. Second, recent conversations on colonialization of aid are exposing fundamental issues which impact adversely on safeguarding and drive safeguarding efforts in directions that are not valuable to take. The premise of aid and development was helping people over there dealing with gender issues they have, without looking at how those in power within the sector contributed to the problem and reinforced inequality and have the same challenges in their own societies and organizations. Again, power and privilege are at the root of this. Those with power will need to give up some of that power, and that will be uncomfortable. So we need to talk about safeguarding as a journey, but there are not a set number of steps that need to be taken in a set order. Often the journey requires working on different aspects of safeguarding in parallel. If, for example, one leaves culture until the last step, then efforts for compliance earlier in the journey may have proven fruitless and eaten up political will, and may indeed not have been the right efforts in the first place. Culture change does take time, but we also fall into the trap of overcomplicating things. Much of this is something we can do easily, in small steps, and every day, and we should just get on with it. So we invite you to listen to the whole discussion, which is available in the linked recording. Thank you.